Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the thin blanket over his frail frame. The room felt heavy with a stillness that was almost alive, the kind that seeps into the heart and makes it ache without reason. Emily had been a nurse for years, had seen more than her share of suffering and farewells. Yet something about this man made her linger. His name was Robert Hayes, 78 years old, a veteran with no listed family, diagnosed with terminal lung disease. His breath came in shallow pulls, each one sounding like it was borrowed from time he didn't have. There was an unspoken weight in the room, a sense that every minute was precious, even if neither of them said it aloud. When Emily first introduced herself, his voice was a faint rasp, the words just barely escaping his lips. He told her name was beautiful, as though it mattered to him that she knew he was paying attention. Over the nights that followed, fragments of his story began to emerge. He had been a soldier once, young and fearless in places torn apart by war. He spoke of deserts, mountains, and distant lands with a kind of detached nostalgia, as if the memories belonged to someone else now. Medals had been given to him for acts of bravery, but he kept them hidden in an old leather bag under his bed, covered in the dust of years. They meant nothing to him anymore, or at least that's what he said. Emily wasn't sure she believed him. She noticed how he never asked for anything. No extra pillows, no special food, but his eyes softened when she stayed by his side a little longer than necessary. He would talk about his comrades, some of whom didn't make it home, and about the guilt that had lived with him ever since. The war had ended for the world, but for Robert, it had never really stopped. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, he whispered that the hardest part of dying wasn't the dying itself. It was wondering whether your life had meant anything at all. Emily didn't give him easy reassurances. She simply held his hand, hoping that silence could speak what words could not. One evening, when the air in the room felt heavier than usual, Robert's breathing grew more strained. Emily stayed long after her shift was over, refusing to leave him alone in that fragile state. The smell of antiseptic hung in the room, mixed with something bittersweet, the scent of endings that could not be postponed. His eyes sought hers, and with a faint movement of his lips, he told her to reach under the bed. She knelt and pulled out the worn leather satchel. Inside were only a few possessions, a faded photograph of young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, a creased and folded letter, and a small velvet box. He nodded toward it, and she opened it with careful fingers. The metal inside gleamed faintly under the harsh hospital lights, its ribbons slightly frayed with age. Emily had seen medals before, but never one like this. Never one that seemed to carry such a weight of history and sacrifice. She told him it was his, but he shook his head weakly. No, he whispered, it was hers now. She protested immediately, saying she hadn't earned it, but he only smiled in that tired, knowing way. He told her that courage wasn't just about facing bullets. It was about fighting battles no one else saw, against pain, against loneliness, against the inevitability of death. She had done that for him. She had made him feel alive in the days when he was only waiting to die. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She told him she couldn't possibly take it, but his hand, frail as it was, closed around hers. He asked her to do this for him, to let him leave knowing the medal was in hands worthy of carrying its story forward. Emily's throat tightened. She realized that saying no would take away the only thing he wanted to give in his final moments. She nodded, holding the medal to her chest as though it were a living thing. In the earliest hours of the morning, when the hospital was at its quietest, Robert slipped away. The monitor gave a single, soft tone before going silent. Emily stayed there long after, his hand still in hers, the medal pressed against her heart. She wasn't his family, but the loss felt as deep and personal as any she had known. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night clung to her like a shadow. When she learned about a small memorial being held for him by local veterans, she went without hesitation. She stood quietly in the back, the medal pinned to her uniform. Some people noticed and looked at her curiously, but she didn't explain. The story was not for everyone. It belonged to her and to the man who had found a way to give meaning to his last hours. The medal never went into a drawer or a box. She carried it in her pocket during every shift. There were nights when the job was too heavy, when she felt the weight of patient's pain pressing against her, when the loneliness of the night shift wrapped around her shoulders like a cold blanket. On those nights, she would reach into her pocket, run her fingers over the metal's cool surface, and hear his voice in her mind. You fight a war every day. You have courage. It became more than just a token. It was a promise, a reminder that even in the quiet corners of the hospital, she could make a difference. Not by saving everyone from death, but by saving them from being forgotten. It reminded her that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen without recognition, in the quiet moments when no one is watching. The metal gleamed under the hospital lights each time she wore it. But to Emily, the shine was not what mattered. What mattered was the story it carried. The story of a dying man who had seen the worst of humanity but still found enough hope to pass on the most precious thing he had to a stranger. In giving it, he had given her more than an object. He had given her purpose, a new way to see the work she did, and a reason to keep going even on the hardest nights. Emily would think of him often. Sometimes it would happen when she was with a patient who had no visitors. Other times it would come when she walked past an empty bed, freshly made for the next person who would need it. She would remember his voice, his eyes, the faint smile when he placed the metal in her hands. And she would remember that her presence in his life had mattered enough to be the last thing he wanted to honor. Life in the hospital went on, as it always did. Patients came and went, some walking out healed, others leaving only in memory. But Emily carried with her a reminder that what she did was more than a job. It was a series of quiet battles fought every day, battles that might never make headlines, but still changed lives. The medal in her pocket wasn't a prize for what she had done. It was a challenge to keep fighting, to keep showing up, to keep being the kind of person who could make someone feel less alone in their final moments. And so, in the rhythm of the hospital nights, among the steady beeps and the whispered footsteps in the hall, Emily found her own way of honoring Robert Hayes. She wore his medal, not as proof of what she had achieved, but as a reminder of the trust he had placed in her. In the end, it wasn't just a veteran giving his medal to a nurse. It was one human being telling another, without hesitation, you matter. And for Emily, there was no higher honor.